Just as a kind of context, this is a picture of the size of midterm losses. Midterm elections, the 2 years after a presidential election, are characterized most of the time by the president's party losing seats. This is 1946 to the present. What you see at a glance is the largest midterm swing in percentage terms in this whole period was the last one. 2010 was a landslide or a tsunami, choose your metaphor. A very bad election for Democrats, who of course occupied the White House. But 2006 was a very bad election for Republicans. It's looking at the size of this bar, they lost proportionally fewer seats, but this is one of 2 elections in a row, along with the following presidential election, where they, having had control of the House since 1994, lost it. And right before that is this anomaly of the only 2 midterm gains in the series, both very small, but the fact that the president's party didn't lose seats twice had political scientists scratching their head and wondering if the midterm loss anomaly was dead, and we had 2 very big ones. So going into 2014, most people would say they expect the Democrats to lose some seats. And most of the political scientists who spend their time arguing about exactly how many seats and where and why and so on, we will focus on essentially national conditions, the fairly low approval rating for the president and to some extent the exposure of the president's party. Democrats have a relatively small number of U.S. House seats at the moment because they're in the minority and they had this bad, awful result in 2010. But there won't be a great deal of attention in the people who are just trying to figure out how many seats will be lost to redistricting. But if you could look state by state, then the redistricting effects will be much larger. So I'm going to focus largely on Illinois, but I'll say a little bit more about other states as well. Or, the national picture. If you looked at, there are lots of forecasters out there who are telling you what to expect from the election. Real Clear Politics is one that's essentially poll-based, collecting all the polls they can get from different races. How many races for the U.S. House are at this point somewhat suspenseful? They've got it at about 10%, these middle ones. The Tossups, 17 seats they think right now. That's 4% of the total. 3% on either side that are leaning to the Republican and the Democrat, but at this point these are fairly close races and the polls are close, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that it's hard to predict who will win. That's 10%, so that's about a little more than 40 seats. Contrast that with senators and governors who compete in states and there's no redistricting, and we're looking at about 30 or 40% of those races being either at the toss-ups, where at this point the polls essentially show a tie, or the lead is so small that they're willing to call it only a leaning lead for one way or the other. That contrast makes people think that there's something about the House that means it's very insulated from competition, and the top suspect generally is redistricting. It must be drawing these districts. Chris just laid out the process. It's done state by state, in every state except for those that have only one U.S. House district where there's no redistricting to be done. Those are the small states: Vermont, North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Delaware, forgetting a couple. Vermont, I said Vermont. In any case, other than those, anywhere you've got at least 2 seats, you've got to draw some lines, and it must be in the drawing of the lines that you end up with hardly any competition compared to the statewide races. We have districts drawn as for the General Assembly as well. So in the bottom here, there aren't enough polls at the state House or state Senate level for anybody like Real Clear Politics or the New York Times Nate Silver-driven site to be making predictions. But if I do a rough guess at how many really close races there are going to be in the state Senate this year, out of the 19 that are up, I have it 11%. It could be a little higher. It's not anywhere near 30 or 40. For the House, I didn't try to make these fine distinctions in the middle, but I did just count the ones where there's nobody running from one of the parties that are utterly safe, and that's a quarter of the seats here, almost 40% there. So you've got about 2/3 of the seats where there's absolutely no suspense. Again, there are districts drawn here, so you might think that must mean this is a function of redistricting. And I want to say yes and no. Yes, there's no question that a lot of these districts are drawn with expressly political purposes, and I'll dwell on that in the case of the Illinois House, the U.S. House races. But the no part is 2 points here. The second one, the clustering of partisan types ensures many safe seats. Think about the counties. The counties turn out to be less competitive than the states that they constitute, or the country as a whole. And the county lines are not drawn for political purposes. It just happens that people who tend to vote Republican and Democratic also tend to be somewhat segregated in where they live. So no matter how you draw the districts, you end up with less competition in districts than in the states in which those districts are drawn, and that's going to be, roughly speaking, more true the more districts are drawn. A state like Maine that has 2 seats can have 2 seats that look a lot like Maine. Big states like California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, Ohio that have more than 15 or so, you end up having districts that look not too much like each other and less like the state as a whole. So that's my redistricting isn't the whole story. That's part of my I wouldn't call it a rebuttal, but qualification of these redistricting, the reason there are so few close races. The other one, the first bullet point here, is that Chris just talked about 2 kinds of gerrymanders: incumbent protection acts that are basically designed in a bipartisan way to help all the incumbents stay in office, and partisan gerrymanders. When a party is picking the lines and its purpose is to maximize the number of seats it wins, it doesn't destroy competitiveness entirely. It skews the races, but it necessarily makes relatively close districts, and then partisan gerrymanders trying not to make them too close, but that are won by it. And what the key to partisan gerrymanders is to make sure the other party wastes a lot of votes. So you want the other party, if you're a Democrat drawing a map, you want Republican districts that are extremely safe, where a lot of Republican votes pile up and are essentially wasted on very, very big margins, but you want closer Democratic margins. So in fact, partisan gerrymanders, though, they are an affront to democracy in the sense that they're expressly designed to produce an outcome, and in some regards to thwart voters' intentions, are also not anathema to competitiveness. So how would I go about trying to demonstrate where there's been gerrymandering of any kind? If I look historically at the Illinois House, this is the sort of data I would use. Here are 4 decades, 4 different maps. The cumulative voting was an entirely different vote system used in the Illinois House until 1980. The height here is just on the vertical axis, what proportion of the seats were won by Democrats, ignoring the vote. And there were Republican majorities and Democratic majorities in this period, and they swung back and forth. Cumulative voting was eradicated by our current governor starting in '82. So from here on, they're more familiar first past the post elections, the most votes wins. The Democrats drew this map, and they did really well. The Republicans drew the map from the '92 to 2000 period, and they didn't. This state has become more democratic over this era, and they didn't win and dominate. They won the control of the House just once. But you see that the Democratic seat shares are smaller than they were in the prior map. Democrats drew the next one from 2002 to 2010, and again, the Democratic shares rose relative to the Republican. So this figure on the left is sort of indirect evidence that there's something to the map making that's determining how many seats are won by which party. On the right, I'm just comparing the aggregate vote and the aggregate seat shares. And at a glance, the point is the red dots here are a map Republicans drew, and we're looking at points that are on the line or below it, where the Republicans are getting about in the cases of the points right on the line, about the seat share you'd expect from a fair map. And if they're below, they're getting more than they deserve. And all the points above, which are drawn in blue, are outcomes where the Democrats drew the map. And in general, they're getting more seats than a larger share of the seats than they got votes, and that again is indirect evidence that the map is favoring them in some way. 2012 is this circle that doesn't look like it's extremely biased compared to other results. It's the only result we have on the new map so far. That's the Illinois House. Let me spend the rest of my time on the U.S. House. And here's my point again, that in fact you can get close races with a map that can quite reasonably be called unfair. Here are the Illinois House results from 2002, 4, 6, 8, and 10 on a map that was, now I said that the Illinois House was a Democratic drawn gerrymander. The Illinois U.S. House map, the congressional map, was, I think most people would agree, a bipartisan incumbent protection act. Democrats and Republicans drew it together. The legislature passed it after a bipartisan vote. And there weren't a lot of close races, and the competition early on was pretty close. In 2002, there were 10 Republican seats, 9 Democratic. It flipped 2004, still 10 and 9 in 2006. Then we had a very good year for the Democrats, and they end up in a 12-7 advantage, and then it flips to 12-7 for the Republicans going into in 2010. But Democrats controlled both houses of the General Assembly and the governorship, so they got to draw the next map. What they drew produced a 12-6 advantage, and we're down to 18 because the state grew slowly enough it lost a seat. That looks like a big swing, and that looks like a gerrymandering kind of result. There were a lot of close races. This middle dashed line shows the races that were between 45 and 55%, what political scientists think of as a close race. There were more close races in 2012 than in most of these prior years, but in the end, they all broke in the Democratic favor, and that looks like a finger on the scale. How did they do it? Well, they did a couple of things, but one of the key things they did is draw districts where Republican incumbents had fewer familiar voters than Democrats. So the vertical axis in this figure is what proportion of a new district was taken from the incumbent's old district. Incumbents develop popularity. They like to have the same voters looking at them each time. And the Republican seats are almost all lower than the Democratic seats in how much of the district on the new map consisted of the district that the incumbent represented before. This is a one-time kind of effect. You draw a new map and cut away the familiar voters for Republicans if you can, if you're trying to hurt them. Democrats did this. They did it very skillfully. All of these hollow circles are cases where Republican incumbents were defeated, and that's how we went from a 12-7 Republican advantage to 12-6 for the Democrats. The 2 points per 16 are two of the Republican incumbents that ended up in the same district and competing in the primary because neither of them had more than 40% of his old district in any new district. So that part is essentially breaking the personal vote. The other half of this, the horizontal axis, is how safe is this district? And for safety here, I'm using the presidential 2008 vote. So I'm comparing the new map and the old map in terms of where, what proportion of the voters in a district supported Barack Obama in the presidential election in 2008. And I'm comparing the even both times so that I'm looking at the same metric. And this quick story about the old and new map here is there were 8 seats that were in what we think of as a competitive range in terms of presidential vote. So these are seats where both Republicans and Democrats were winning, or there were some close races. And that's more than a 55% presidential vote for Obama because this is his home state. So there's a natural advantage for him. So it isn't that it was a close presidential election. It's just that with that kind of presidential vote share in the district was close in congressional terms. On the new map, there are only 2 seats in that range. And the others have been pushed one extra to the Republican side, but mostly to the Democratic side. So not only in terms of breaking normal vote, but in terms of the breaking personal vote, but also the normal voting habits of the districts, the new map was drawn in such a way that it should be harder for Republicans to win seats. The numbers here are the races that anybody thinks are close. I said Real Clear Politics thinks there are some close races, and not a lot, but 10% of the U.S. House races. 2 of them of the toss-ups are Illinois, the 13th and the 10th. And the 10th is out here where it's breaking this prediction that you can use the Obama vote share to identify a close district. The 10th is essentially defying that, the assumption I'm making that we can use presidential vote as a proxy for the normal vote. The 12th and the 17th are leaning districts. So there are 4 races in Illinois that Real Clear Politics thinks are somewhat suspenseful. And in that respect, this isn't an election where competition has been destroyed or killed, but it is an election where the map was clearly skillfully drawn to deliver a particular outcome, and that is more Democratic seats. Last point, I use the term toss-ups because that's what Real Clear Politics calls them. Are these things really toss-ups? Can we look at these and say one of these, coin flip kind of situation, one will go to the Dems, one to the Reaps? Well, actually, the toss-up terminology is a little misleading. If you look at what happened in 2012, 10 of the 11 toss-up states in the presidency went to the Democrats. 6 of the 7 U.S. Senate seats went to the Democrats. They won 21 of the 33 U.S. House seats. So these aren't really toss-ups in the true sense of a fair coin. It's more like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, the Tom Stoppard play, where at the beginning they're flipping heads and they flip and flip. And in fact, they get 78 heads in a row. And one of them says, what about the suspense? And says, what suspense? He says, well, it's an even chance.